This morning, Jeff talked about the intersection of the old and the new, and I expected references to things borrowed and things blue, but that didn't happen. And that's the only joke I've written for the day, so there we are. But one of the fascinating features of Western history over the past 3 centuries, I think, is that just as we have constantly emphasized the virtue of the old and the virtue of the new, from the agricultural revolution of the 18th century down to the Internet of Things in the 21st century, we've also celebrated the old, both hand in hand. So today, for example, archaeologists use drones and ground radar to discover new sites. Epigraphers read unrolled scrolls from Herculaneum carbonized during the Vesuvius eruption by using microcomputer tomography. And archaeobotanists can reconstruct the diets of ancient people by studying fragments of seeds under microscopes. And on it goes. The old and the new live side by side in the study of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world, and they have done so very dramatically since, well, especially Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in the year 1799. So it's the new and the old have lived together for a while now. Now, in what I'm about to say, I'm going to use the word text. And in our title of CSART, I don't really like that acronym, but we're going to work on that a little bit. We talk about text. What do we mean by text exactly? And I think you've heard that we're using the word text in 2 different ways at the same time. Partly we mean literary creations that someone has made. But we also mean the objects on which those creations are produced and circulated. Now, in modern times, the separation between the first kind of text and the second kind of text is actually quite wide. You can reprint a text in any number of different editions and in any number of different ways. In ancient times, often these two are quite closely associated. And some ancient texts come down to us in exactly 1 copy, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Others were circulated more widely, but perhaps even then still come down to us in 1 copy. So I'm going to talk about texts in the first sense and also a little bit about text in the second sense. So in encountering ancient texts, especially those that have to do with religion, the combination of the old and the new remains very relevant. The methods we use in reading these texts and understanding their content continue to evolve both in response to knowledge of the texts themselves and to our own developing interests. For example, we notice things in them that have been there all along, but we had perhaps not seen before. And conversely, we sometimes decide that our ancestors' readings of those texts are not the things we're most interested in. So today, for example, we talk about text and gender and sexuality, or conceptions about what it means to live in a body, things that were in the text all along, but that perhaps our ancestors hadn't noticed. And yet, because these texts come to us as something outside ourselves, as artifacts of a previous culture, with ideas, practices, assumptions, and values different from our own, they continue to challenge us to think more deeply about the world in which we live. So what I want to do in the next few minutes are 3 things. Good preacher's number. First, I want to talk about what you do after you find a text. After the discovery of the text, how do we bring it to the stage of translation and presentation in a critical edition? The second thing we need to think about is how we study a text's literary architecture and its background. And then about how we might place it in dialogue with our own world and our own situation. So let me start then, the first thing, text and translations. Let me start with a text that, as far as I know, is the oldest English text reflecting on the art of translation, which is the prologue to the Wycliffe Bible of the late 14th century. This is not the prologue, this is the Gospel of John, but good enough. I think some of what the Wycliffites said 600 years ago still matters. No, I'm not a terrible speller. This is the way they did it. And I will read part of it in what I think of as Middle English, but don't think I've taken some substance that I shouldn't have. For as much as Christ saith that the gospel shall be preached in all the world, and David saith of the apostles in her preaching, the sound of him gaed out into each land, and the word as of him gaeden out into the endes of the world. Also Christ saith of the Jews that cried an Hosanna to him in the temple, that though they weren stille stunes schulen cry, and by stunes he understandeth heathen men that worshiped in stunes for her goddess. And we English men, here's the punchline maybe, we English men been common of heathen men, therefore we been understanden by this stones that shoulden cry holy writ, and as Jews interpreted knowledge, signify clergy that should know God by repentance of sins and by the voice of hearing God, so our common men, Luidamen, sing the cornerstone Christ, might be signified by the stones that been hard and abiding in the fundament. For though covetous clerks, greedy preachers, we would say, been wooed by simony, heresy, and many other sins, and despising and stopping holy writ as much as they maun, yet the lewed people crieth after holy writ to conne it with great cost and peril of her life. Having butchered an English text, we will go to more obscure languages. The prologue opens its argument for an English translation of the Bible by appealing to, one, the rights of the people to hear Scripture in their own language, especially given the precedent of much earlier translations into Anglo-Saxon. Two, a tightly woven series of biblical texts, notably the Psalms and Gospel texts quoting the Psalms, which locate the praise of God within the proper life of all human beings. Three, Scripture as a medium for that praise, and therefore, four, access to Scripture in the vernacular as a necessary condition of the fulfillment of such a goal. By allegorically equating the crying stones with the heathen and their descendants, that is, the English-speaking audience of the prologue, the Wycliffites situate their endeavor within the ambit of Jesus' mission itself, scholarship and service of God. The prologue goes on to justify and explain the translation of the Vulgate into the English vernacular. Whatever the moral imperative of such an action, and the Wycliffites certainly believed in that moral imperative, the challenge of technique always presents itself. Does one translate word for word or thought by thought or something in between? For these 14th century scholars, the best translating, quote, is out of the Latin into English to translate after the sentence and not only after the words, so that the sentence be as open, either openere, in English as in Latin, and go not far from the letter. Or again, at the beginning, quote, at the beginning I purposed with God's help to make the sentence as true and open, by which he means clear, right, in English as it is in Latin, or more true and more open than it is in Latin. This is not very far from the modern slogan, as literal as possible, as free as necessary. Such a strategy is not always easy to carry out in practice, but it does promise a readable yet accurate translation. For the Wycliffites, another ingredient in the making of good translation was attention to the accuracy of the translated text itself. Now, they're translating from the Vulgate, though they know the Bible was not written in Latin. It was written in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic. They note that in their handwritten Bibles, they included marginal notes at points at which the Vulgate differed from the Hebrew, especially in the book of Psalms, because, quote, that of all our books discordeth most from Hebrew, unquote, meaning Jerome got it wrong more often there than elsewhere. We see here already a rudimentary attention to finding the most accurate available text, a practice of textual criticism that Hellenistic scholars of Homer had done centuries earlier, but that had to be resuscitated in the early modern period. So far then, the Wycliffites' approach seems very modern, or rather characteristic of both classical antiquity and of modernity. But there's a final element here, and it's relevant to the CSART, I think, an element that most modern scholars would place far in the background, if not neglect altogether. For the prologue to the Wycliffite Bible, the act of Bible translation required a spiritual maturity as well as a linguistic skill. So it asserts that, quote, if men now were as holy as Jerome was, they might translate out of Latin into English as he did out of Hebrew and out of Greek into Latin, and all they should not translate now, as somebody thinks, for default of holiness and of cunning. By cunning they mean knowledge or learning, but they may match it with holiness. The text takes pains to note that Jerome's holiness, though great, was inferior to that of the Bible's authors, the prophets and apostles, and therefore his capacities did not exceed that of other people in principle. Therefore, the sanctity of the Vulgate did not imply the inferiority of an English translation. Now, while modern scholars might agree that such virtues as diligence, honesty, curiosity, passion for the subject, attention to the facts, all animate our work, holiness does not always seem required. More's the pity. So let me step back from all of that. How do you go about translating, editing, studying an ancient text? Once we agree that a translation or a critical edition is worth making, the artistry of the scholar has to come into play. And like all arts, bodies of knowledge and skills of practice are relevant. The act of translation presupposes knowledge of several things. Most basically, a writing system, grammar and syntax of the languages involved, vocabulary, and maybe most elusively, the social practices involved in the ancient text to be translated. So how do you learn these things? And I'm doing some very basic things now. First of all, let's start with the writing system. Human beings invented writing about 3200 BCE in ancient Sumer, the southern part of today's Iraq. The first text we have, which are highly pictographic, this is a Jimdet Nasser text. It's late 4th millennium BC. You can see it's highly pictographic. Most of these earliest texts were simple accounting texts. They're receipts and contracts, which were used to keep track of business transactions. Accountants gave us one of the greatest inventions in human history and are responsible for a major part of our civilization. So if you can read a book, thank an accountant. That's what I say. Though it soon became clear to ancient people that they could use this system for more than just keeping track of how much Inmer Kar paid for Enheduanna for her cows. Those are real names, by the way, in case you're looking for them for your own children. Writing became useful for all sorts of texts, including prayers and songs, epics and myths, historical narratives about royal successes or less often royal failures, and so on. And the earliest writing system, which is called cuneiform after the wedge-like shapes of the signs, developed for Sumerian and then moved quickly into another language completely unrelated but shared by their neighbors, Akkadian. And there, in Akkadian, the system remained at home for about 3,000 years, the last cuneiform tablets being written shortly after the lifetime of Jesus. The relationship between these two texts, which is a sprachbund as it's called, continued for at least a couple of thousand years. Sumerian words survived in Akkadian as determinatives, words that identify a category of the word following. So, for example, the Sumerian word lu or person comes before Akkadian proper names in these texts, for example. Some Sumerian words moved into Akkadian and then into other languages. For example, the Sumerian word Agal, the big house, became the Akkadian word ekalum and then the Hebrew word hekal, a temple or a palace. Or maybe even more dramatically, the Sumerian word kana, which means a reed, eventually found its way to Greek as kanon and to English as canon, C-A-N-O-N. If you can have a biblical canon, thank the Sumerians. Ancient people were themselves aware of the antiquity of their writing system. In the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian Emperor Assurbanipal, who reigned from 668 to 627 and is mentioned in the Bible, boasted of his ability to, quote, read inscriptions before the flood, unquote. By this time, cuneiform had been around for more than 2,000 years, and it had evolved dramatically over that time, a fact that required an educated scribe to learn how to read texts that were already ancient. In Assurbanipal's case, over 2,000 years old already. One would need to master about 700 signs and their permutations over time. Such knowledge reflected, in part, the age-old need to know for the sake of knowing, but there were more pragmatic reasons. For example, when a king decided to renovate a temple, he would consult the ancient texts dedicating the building and even have them displayed in the renovated structure as museum pieces. The aim was to follow the inherited floor plans on the assumption that they enjoyed divine approval. So learning the ancient scripts was a way of ensuring divine favor. So no wonder the most powerful man in the world would boast about his ability to read and write. Now, the craft of writing was apparently discovered several times independently in human history. It did move from the center in Sumer, first to Egypt, very shortly thereafter, that in the famous hieroglyphic scripts deciphered by Champollion, who was connected to Napoleon's expedition. Napoleon's connected to everything, just for the record. You don't get many Napoleon jokes, but there's one. The later alphabetic scripts developed from simplified forms of hieroglyphics somewhere around 2000 BC and evolved into most of the alphabetic scripts used around the world today. So Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Cyrillic, Arabic scripts all have a common ancestor. Other writing systems evolved more directly from cuneiform, including Hittite, Elamite, and the Old Persian scripts. Still other hieroglyphic scripts also developed in the Near East, such as Linear B, which is an early form of Greek, and the still undeciphered Linear A, and also Linear C. The idea of such a technology spread from Mesopotamia, even if the precise forms of the symbols did not. Further afield, however, writing seems to have been invented independently. This was true in the Indus Valley around 3000 BC, and then in China a few centuries later. And that case is interesting because there's no evidence that the Chinese borrowed this idea from the Near East. Maybe they did, but there's no evidence. And that script, of course, then influences Japanese. By the way, there's also the case of Korean, which as far as I know is the only alphabet in the world that's not descended from the Near Eastern linear alphabet. It was invented in the early 1400s. And even further afield, the Mayans, of course, invented a writing system without any influence of the old world, though it's possible that aliens were connected somehow. Now, obviously, then, a translator has to know the writing system. This is the tablet from the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's the tablet with the famous flood story of Atrahasis, who built a boat and, on landing on the mountain, sent forth birds to tell whether the land was dry or not. And hieroglyphics and a disc that has not yet been deciphered, a script that is still a mystery, the Phaistos disc from Crete. This is mid-2nd millennium BC. Nobody knows what it says. Or this text, which is in Hebrew, the carpet page from Codex Leningrad, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible from the year 1009. This is the colophon in which the scribe dedicates the text. So, writing systems. This is also relevant not at a deeper level. Sometimes an ancient scribe, well, for example, it's possible to date manuscripts, at least roughly, by studying the forms that the letters themselves take. There's a science called paleography. Sometimes also an ancient scribe might make an error in copying two similar looking or sounding words. And I'll give you an example here. This is also from Codex Leningrad, from 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 2. And if you'll notice the line in the larger print, the second line from the bottom, you notice there's a vowel, Hatef Patak, right? Well, there. It's high-tech presentation. That's not connected to a consonant. It's just floating all by itself. The reason is because the scribes copying the manuscript knew that the original text that they were copying had made a mistake. and they knew how to correct the mistake, but they did not feel free to correct the consonants of the text. So they simply correct the vowels. And so instead of the text saying, Hine lo ase vi davar gadol u o davar katon, which is gibberish, yes, it really is gibberish, instead of saying that, they corrected, they add two things. They know that instead of lo meaning to him, it should say lo with an aleph meaning not. Sounds the same, but it looks different. And they know instead of saying a'aseh, they should have said ya'aseh, he will do. And that's the correct text. The scribes, however, know how to correct a text while preserving the consonantal original that they're copying. And that's something we have to know about. Now, so a little bit about writing. Let's talk about grammar, syntax, and vocabulary, which is what everybody always wants to talk about. Now, obviously, language arose long before human beings invented writing systems, right? There's a debate you may know as to whether the Neanderthals had language. But certainly human beings, modern human beings had language millennia before they wrote any of it down. So the challenge is then to study not just the writing system, but the grammar and syntax and vocabulary. Now, we have the advantage today, because of 300 plus years of scholarship, of using dictionaries and grammars and works like that. And if you're studying Arabic, the grammars go back about 1,000 years, because the Muslims were the first to do this kind of scholarly work in the late first millennium AD. But not always have these things been around. In ancient times, however, people already felt the need to be able to move from one language to another. So they invented, as early as the 3rd millennium BC, glossary lists in Sumerian or Akkadian for obscure words or classes of things that were exotic. And then by the early 2nd millennium BC, we have extant texts in which Sumerian and Akkadian words are in parallel columns, giving a kind of bilingual dictionary. And later in the 2nd millennium, occasionally there are texts with 3 languages, Sumerian, Akkadian, Hittite, or Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hurrian. I think 1 or 2 examples of 4. Such primitive dictionaries served the scribes copying text in languages perhaps other than their mother tongue. Now, for the student of ancient religious texts, it's probably useful to know several things about this ancient scholarship. First, a scribe or government official would have to know more than one language to be taken seriously. Now, this is clear from a text like 2 Kings 18:17 through 37, in which the Assyrian emissary, the Rabshakeh, you remember the story, the Rabshakeh comes to the besieged city of Jerusalem, and he starts making a speech in Hebrew, which unfortunately everybody understands. And so then the government leaders, the scribes, Shebna and Yoah, and the major domo, the chamberlain of the palace, Eliakim, ask him to speak in Aramaic, a language that they understood, but presumably most people didn't. And of course, the Assyrian scribes used every day. So you have to know more than one language. Secondly, some aspects of the scholarship could creep into the texts such scribes produced in all sorts of ways. For example, we have in Hebrew an idiom, shana ta'am. Ta'am usually means a taste. And you ask yourself, how do you change a taste? Which is what shana ta'am ought to mean. But if you know that shanu tema in Akkadian means to change your mind, then suddenly the Hebrew text that made very little sense makes all kinds of sense. Words travel from one language and expressions travel from one language to another, especially government words, technology words, things like that. And so it's helpful to know that. Some biblical texts depend for their interpretation on knowledge of things like that, as when Isaiah 40 to 55 talks on and on about Babylonian theology. Or Ezekiel 27 through 29 talk about the theology of the city of Tyre. Well, it'd be nice to know something about that. Third, the migration of various texts, extensive texts, from one language to another could occur. We all know about the translation of the Bible first into Greek and then into other languages, beginning in antiquity, 3rd century BC already. But the art of translation was older. For example, the Old Babylonian and Standard Babylonian versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which come from the early 2nd millennium and the late 2nd millennium respectively, both contain material that originated in Sumerian, even though the texts are in Akkadian. And it's no wonder, because the real Gilgamesh, who seems to have been a real person, a ruler of the town of Uruk, would have spoken Sumerian. And the stories about him would have been in Sumerian. It's also interesting, by the way, speaking of Gilgamesh, that his tradition has some influence on later stories. There are lots of parallels between Gilgamesh and, say, the stories of Samson. And it is interesting that we have a text of Gilgamesh from Megiddo from the late Bronze Age, just before the Israelite period. So the text was known by at least some people. And even in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls, 4Q 530, which is a text about the antediluvian giants, theme I'll come back to later because everybody wants to know about giants, the name of one of the giants is Gilgamesh. So the name travels about. He also shows up in the 1001 Nights, and not by name, but some of the stories, along with Sinbad and Aladdin and all the rest of them. Now, or, to take another example from the Bible, Proverbs 22:17 through 24:22 seems to be a Hebrew language reworking of an Aramaic translation of an Egyptian original called the Wisdom of Amenemope. There are very close parallels between the two texts. Amenemope is older than Proverbs, and therefore it must have moved into an Israelite situation at some point. So a little bit about language. And now a little bit about sociology. This is leading inevitably into the bigger questions of sociology, about how ancient people lived. Think, for example, about the story of the Tower of Babel in the book of Genesis, which is set at the great ziggurat of Babylon, the Esagila. But, yes, it is. But which more importantly revolves around the question of whether human beings should all gather in one place or be dispersed all over the world. Now, the Bible, of course, opts for cultural diversity, sees that as a good, even if it decried the folly of worshiping the gods of the nations. And this theme of diversity, however, is much older. Long before the writing of the Bible, the Sumerians told the story of the ancient ruler of Uruk, Enmerkar, who in some traditions is Gilgamesh's father, and his embassy to the Iranian town of Arata. The text opens with a sort of once upon a time incantation by the god Nudimmud or Enki, describing an older world in which there were no wild animals and all the people could, quote, address Enlil truly, but in one single tongue, unquote. They all spoke the same language. The story continues with Enmerkar, as the story unfolds, with Enmerkar convincing the ruler of Arata to open up his lapis lazuli mines, gemstones, to trade with the stone-poor Mesopotamian homeland. And that's interesting. But the most interesting point is that when the Aratians see letters from Enmerkar written in cuneiform, they're scared because the text looks so angry. And maybe if you look at that, you can say, it does look a bit angry, doesn't it? At least to them. But the point is, it's strange, it's alien. It's alien to them. There's an awareness of cultural diversity. In the religious texts we study, whether they're related to the Bible directly, indirectly, or not at all, the presence of culture is pervasive. Translating a text like this requires some awareness of those cultural variants. Ancient texts embed within them concepts of marriage, birth, death, healthcare, economic relationships, the symbolism of human-made objects, architecture, and many other aspects of culture which may or may not be like our assumptions about those things. Translating them requires more than just the knowledge of the vocabulary, the grammar, or the syntax. It also requires some sense of the environment in which this text arose. Let me give another biblical example, or rather an ancient Near Eastern example, and the example of lament, because everybody wants to talk about lament. Let's begin with the most famous example of a lament, the book of Lamentations. This work was a response, as you know, to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 BC. It uses a number of ancient literary techniques. For example, the acrostic. Each of the first 4 chapters is an acrostic poem. One line starts with Aleph, then Beit, and Gimel, and so on. And the acrostic, of course, at least in this case, presupposes an alphabet. This text also uses motifs like the personification of a city as a woman, the depiction of an angry deity who must be soothed, and even the practice of collecting such prayer poems in groups of 5, which is you also see in Mesopotamian collections. Now, I'm not saying the text isn't original, because in many, many ways it is profound, beautiful, but it also has antecedents in the world before it. In fact, the practice of creating literature mourning the destruction of a major city goes back much further, to the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium after the fall of the Ur III dynasty, when speakers of Sumerian composed 2 laments for the destruction of Ur, the city of Ur, Abraham's city, right? Maybe, possibly. The first lament speaks of how the god Nana, the city's patron deity, appealed to the chief god An not to carry out the decreed destruction of the city and its temples, but to no avail. A refrain in the text speaks of how the god, quote, has abandoned his stable, his sheepfold became haunted, unquote. The idea, by the way, of a god abandoning a temple also shows up in Ezekiel, right? It's kind of a major theme in Ezekiel, actually. The lament for Ur goes on to speak of the demolition of the temples themselves, along with the violent death of the elders and other important people, precisely the same mix of themes that appear in the biblical text as well over a millennium later. The major difference between the two, of course, is that Israelite theology allows for only one God, who must argue with himself, not with other gods, about the fate of a city, as happens in, say, the book of Hosea, or in Lamentations. Now, it's difficult to show a direct connection between the 2 texts. Israelite scribes probably didn't read Sumerian, or even this particular Sumerian text. But we're dealing with a more generalized cultural practice, of which these are 2 examples. We cannot easily connect all the dots. But it is worth noting that there are some other laments for the destructions of cities in the Bible itself, like Ezekiel 19 or Psalm 80, or some of the mock laments of foreign cities, also in the Bible, and from first millennium Assyria. So there are things to talk about here. Now, it's not always the case, contrary to popular opinion, that the winners write history. Sometimes the losers do. There are many examples of that. Yet it is also true that sometimes the winners do get to write the history. And even they, however, cannot do so without accidentally representing the viewpoint of the loser. Consider, for example, this picture. You may have seen this in the British Museum. It is a relief from Sennacherib's palace in Nimrud, in which he depicts the destruction of the city of Lachish in Judah. Wonderful, and you see it's a very active kind of scene, spears and rocks flying and dead bodies impaled and all of that sort of thing, splashy kind of relief. And originally, of course, like all these reliefs in the Assyrian palaces, they were painted. So it would have been in bright colors, blue and white, and occasionally the remains of the colors remain. But I want to point out these people right here. Women leaving the city. Presumably the army has allowed them to leave, like people left Aleppo a few weeks ago. Where do they go? What do they do afterward? The sculpture doesn't tell us those things, because its aim is not to document the fate of the miserable of the earth, but to celebrate Assyrian power. And yet, these sorts of people are precisely the ones who gave us the Lamentations we're talking about, or at least the artists making those texts adopt their point of view, which is not quite the same thing. The historian of ancient texts and the cultures that produced them have to consider these kinds of angles too. I wish I had art as beautiful as Father Justin did this morning. This is not quite the same, I'm afraid, but I don't. And yet there are things here that are worth looking at. So then next to last point. These considerations then lead us to focus on the text not just as artifacts or objects, but as literary creations. The study of text in a given, as the study of a text in a given ancient language matures, some disciplines are relatively new, a generation or two old. Some, like biblical studies, have been around for 2,000 years. As a discipline matures, it often turns from simply trying to get the words and the sentences right to something else. I would argue something more sophisticated, but something else. You notice this if you've studied classics or biblical studies. Issues of textual criticism, linguistics, and so on are never very far away, but they enter into service of something more complex. This is true for the study of the Bible and the huge tradition that has come out of the Bible, commentaries and songs and sermons and all the rest. It's true for the study of the Quran as well, which has produced a similarly enormous tradition of influence. Those are undoubtedly the two most influential books in human history. The Iliad might be third, I guess. I don't know. The Analects of Confucius. It's a small list. To illustrate this point, let me just give one example. Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. Very clear text. When humanity began to multiply on the ground, daughters were born to them. That part's clear, right? Then the sons of God saw that the daughters of humanity were lovely, and so they took for themselves wives from all they chose. So the Lord said, "My spirit will not remain," the Hebrew word is yadon, "on the human beings forever, inasmuch as it is also flesh. So its days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were also in the lands in those days, as well as later, the ones about whom it should be noted that the sons of God came to the daughters of humanity and gave birth to them. They were the mighty men of old, the men of renown." This text is famously obscure, which is why every year some student asks if he or she can write about it in one of my classes, and I usually say no. Though I think, no, God help me, but I don't say that out loud. But I would notice some things are clear and some things are not clear. Well, humanity spread involves the production of daughters, so that's obvious. The beauty of human beings attract the heavenly beings, whom post-biblical text and the Septuagint calls angeloi, angels, or in the book of Enoch they're called the watchers, but in the Bible they're called simply the sons of God or the sons of the gods. But still, that's not totally clear. An ancient Near Eastern audience would have understood these as minor deities, not necessarily angels, but what exactly is the difference? And also, verse 3 notes the relative transience of humankind. They only live at most 120 years. But why is the verse here? What does it have to do with anything? Is the point that their transience makes them bad mates for the angels? What exactly is the point? It's not clear. And what does the word remain mean? Actually, the word only appears once in the Bible. The Septuagint translates it as remain, katamene, but what it means in Hebrew is not clear at all. And then verse 4 is a kind of commentary about the Nephilim who arose and who apparently survived the flood, right? Because they're mentioned in other biblical texts later, and who are somehow the product of this illicit sexuality. It is worth noting that in the ancient world, lots of people are said to be the offspring of a deity and a human being. Gilgamesh is 2/3 a god. Apparently, the god part overbears, right? It ought to be half and half, but somehow it overbears. Or Achilles, right? Or any number of people whose mothers Zeus happened to stalk. So these themes are out there. It is interesting, of course, that the Bible distances itself from that tradition and sees these people as problematic. It's also interesting that even the phrase, the sons of the gods, or the sons of God, Banayu Ili or Banayu Ilani, appears in Ugaritic texts, a Canaanite text from earlier than the biblical period. And so on it goes. It's also interesting that this text has been commented on by a great many Jewish and Christian readers. Just in the first 200 years, there are extensive comments on it from Athenagoras, Justin Martyr, the Shepherd of Hermas, Irenaeus, Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, Pseudo-Clement of Rome, Lactantius, Methodius of Olympus, and especially Origen, who came back to it over and over again, and probably there are others. But the most famous interpreter is, I suppose, well, most interesting to me interpreter is Philo, who was roughly contemporary of Jesus's, who talks about the Nephilim and the giants and understands them as symbols, yes, as real beings, but as symbols of the virtues and the vices. The bad angels choose human productions, the vices that are negative. The good angels presumably choose the virtues, which means, of course, they don't marry human beings. Though it's hard to move, it's hard to get this allegorically to work all right. And there's a lot to say about Origen in this too. These texts have histories. And that brings me finally and at last to my last point. The idea of interpreting texts that were already ancient is itself an ancient idea. People have been founding centers for the study of ancient texts since at least the first millennium BC. Assurbanipal, running his great library, had agents who were copying texts all over Mesopotamia and sending copies to his library. There was a trade, there was a business trade in trading copies of texts in the first millennium BC and probably earlier. And the idea that scholars would be assembled in one place to study these ancient texts is itself an old idea, and one with great value and beauty and wonder, and it's a good idea. And we stand, therefore, in this long tradition. We do so with our own techniques and our own interests, our own technologies. We do so with the awareness that someday it's likely other human beings will speak of us as ancient people and will wonder what we did and will perhaps even read our texts. We hope they're very selective in doing so. Yeah. Pray for fires in some cases, I think. But there is another dimension here that I want us to end with. It's the one the Wyclifites had as well. The Wyclifites believed that the scholar should also be a holy person. Now, as part of this center, we take that idea seriously, not in a narrow way. We realize that excellent scholars have other ideas, maybe from other religious traditions or none at all, and that's certainly the case, and maybe virtuous people in many ways. And so we are not saying this in a narrow kind of way. But we also think that the study of these ancient texts can be formative. Certainly a text about the ladder of ascent has obvious formative implications. The study of the Bible can, and the study of the text preceding the Bible can, under certain circumstances. But also it is the act of study, of preserving for the future the legacy of the past, with its wisdom and its folly. It is this act of study itself that is a noble and consecrated effort, because it allows us to contact our own humanity, or as a Christian, I would say our humanity before God. It allows us to recognize our own frailty, our own limitations, our own fragility, and also our own capacity to know and pass on the truth. And so it is, for me, an honor to be part of the beginning of that conversation today. Thank you very much.